Welcome to Historic Lullabies. I'm so glad you're here. Whether this is your first time joining us or you're a returning traveler through time, tonight, we're stepping into a world filled with whispers behind latticed windows, poetry exchanged in silence, and rules so peculiar they seem like riddles wrapped in rosewater. Imagine the soft flicker of a candle in a distant window. A breeze curls through the alley, carrying the scent of jasmine and dust. You walk slowly, your footsteps cushioned by worn stones. Somewhere above you, a curtain sways. Was that just the wind or a signal? This was once the rhythm of romance in the Ottoman Empire. Courtship in this era wasn't declared loudly in ballrooms or on bended knee in moonlit gardens. No, it unfolded like a long, layered sigh, whispered through silk veils, scented cloths, and glances as brief as a heartbeat. It was filled with coded messages and quiet rebellion. To love and be loved meant learning the rules, and then knowing precisely how to bend them just enough. Now, I do hope this story helps you relax, perhaps even drift into a gentle sleep as the shadows lengthen and the past fold around you. But I must offer a soft warning. You might find the rules of Ottoman romance so strange, so intricate, that sleep will have to wait its turn. Still, if that happens, well, you'll wake with a delightful new fact to share. Perhaps about how a slice of quince meant, "Yes, I like you," and how a handkerchief folded just so might have broken a heart. Before we float too far into tonight's story, a gentle like or subscribe would mean a lot. It helps Historic Lullabies continue spinning these quiet tales into the night. And if you're listening from somewhere cozy around the world, I'd love to know where you are and what time it is as you press play. Midnight in Istanbul, afternoon in Manila. Let's time travel together. Now, take a slow, deep breath in and out. Let's begin. Long before social media and speed dating apps, long before handwritten love letters became the stuff of nostalgia, there was a different way to fall in love, one that didn't always begin with words, but often with presence. The Ottoman Empire, vast and varied in its people and customs, fostered a courtship culture shaped by both public modesty and private intensity. It all begins with the home. Ottoman society, especially in urban centers like Istanbul, was structured around the family household, compact, layered spaces where modesty was prized and privacy was precious. Women lived mostly within the domestic quarters, often behind intricately carved wooden screens or thin latticework called mashrabia. These allowed them to look out without being fully seen. The outside world passed by like a story through gauze. And yet, romance still happened. A young man might walk the same street every afternoon, timing his steps to the rhythm of a particular home's window being cracked open. He might carry a handkerchief in his breast pocket soaked in rosewater, hoping a certain someone behind the mashrabia would notice. She might not respond for days. Then, one day, a candle would appear in the window just after sundown. A flicker, a pause, a breath. That was enough. This slow unfolding, like the careful unwrapping of a treasured cloth, was everything. In Ottoman culture, courtship wasn't a sprint toward affection, but a labyrinth of tiny, deliberate gestures. It was patience adorned with poetry, timing, observation, subtlety. These were the ingredients of a romance that could last a lifetime, or remain forever suspended in possibility. For those outside the empire, such customs might seem strange or overly elaborate, but for those within, it was an art. Courtship was woven into everyday life like fine embroidery, detailed, intentional, and best appreciated slowly. Nothing was ever stated plainly, and that was the point. Directness could be seen as bold, even vulgar. A well-executed courtship was quiet, indirect, and deeply elegant. Even the architecture conspired to preserve this delicate game. Windows were high and covered, doors were layers deep, balconies were enclosed. Yet, in these boundaries, lovers learned to dance. A shadow moving past at the right time of day might be enough to quicken a heartbeat. A scent in the breeze might say, "I was here," and sometimes a mother would catch it all and pretend not to. Because mothers, oh, they were part of the system, too. They watched, listened, and sometimes played matchmaker behind the scenes. But that's a story for another section. For now, it's enough to imagine that first spark, the moment where someone becomes aware of being watched, not in fear, but in fascination. The comfort of a familiar stranger walking by at the same hour each day. The thrill of leaving a small item in view and wondering if it was noticed. A candle in the window, a hope in the heart. And so, as we drift further into this gentle tale, you may begin to see how courting in the Ottoman world wasn't just about love. It was about language, but not the kind you speak. It was the language of stillness, of suggestion, of small things done with great care. The rules may seem strange to us now, but to them, these rituals were the very threads of connection. Somewhere in the distance, a courtyard stirs. You hear the soft clink of ceramic cups, the rustle of fabric, and faint laughter rising like steam through the morning air. The sun is gentle here, filtered through fig leaves and wood-latticed windows. You sit quietly in a shaded corner, and in your hands rests something small and simple, a folding fan, perhaps decorated with painted roses or embroidered vines. But in this world, it's more than an ornament. It's a sentence, a declaration, maybe even a refusal. In the Ottoman Empire, when words couldn't be spoken freely between young women and suitors, objects became stand-ins for language, not metaphors, exactly, more like messengers in disguise. A fan, a fruit, a flower. These were the vocabulary of courtship, small, portable, and full of meaning. You imagine a girl sitting across a shared courtyard, surrounded by the safety of family, and yet perfectly aware of the young man pacing just beyond the fig tree. She lifts her fan and flicks it open with a flick of the wrist. A pause, then a soft tap against her cheek. To him, this gesture isn't idle. It's an answer. Yes, I see you. But if she snaps the fan shut and rests it in her lap? No, not today. So much depended on rhythm, not just of movement, but of understanding. To court someone in the Ottoman world meant learning a code that was never written down, passed only through watching others, listening carefully, interpreting shadows and symbols. It wasn't just romantic, it was a kind of performance, a gentle game of layered meaning. And the fan wasn't the only player on this quiet stage. Fruits, ripe, colorful, fragrant, became another sort of language. A quince, golden and firm, often meant interest or affection. In some regions, offering a quince was like giving a bouquet of red roses today. But it wasn't just about handing it over. The way it was presented, when and where, all that mattered. If a quince appeared on the doorstep wrapped in a white cloth, it might mean, "We should speak soon." If it arrived already sliced, or worse, bruised, well, the meaning changed entirely. Then there were pomegranates, bursting with seeds and layered in symbolism. A girl might leave one on a neighbor's balcony, tucked among fresh herbs. Was it an accident? Was it an invitation? That depended on the eyes that found it. And if someone peeled the fruit and left only a few scattered seeds in return, that, too, was an answer. You can see now how nothing was ever simple, and yet, that was the charm. In a time when social restrictions separated the sexes, and modesty was as much an expectation as it was a virtue. Love had to get creative. It had to hide in plain sight. It had to learn to speak without speaking. Even the market became a place of possibility. Picture yourself walking slowly through a busy bazaar, trailing just behind your mother or aunt. There's chatter, bargaining, the smell of spice and sun-warmed figs. And then you pause, very slightly, near a basket of cherries. Across the lane, someone else pauses too. A coin is exchanged, a paper bag passed, nothing is said, but a cherry lands on the ground between you, as if by accident. You look down, you don't pick it up. You smile. Was that real? Was it coincidence? In Ottoman romance, ambiguity was not only tolerated, it was celebrated. Not knowing for sure kept the heart engaged. It allowed room for imagination, for longing, for dreams to bloom before reality stepped in. But, of course, this language wasn't universal. It shifted from city to village, from one ethnic group to another, from generation to generation. What meant interest in Istanbul might signal rejection in Bursa. That was part of the risk, and also the thrill. If love was a dance, this was the music, delicate, improvisational, almost invisible to those not listening closely. And what about mistakes? Oh, they happened. A misread fan, a wrongly chosen fruit, a handkerchief folded the wrong way. Sometimes it caused embarrassment, sometimes it sparked laughter. But often, these slips created their own kind of intimacy, a shared secret, a soft crack in the surface of the rules that allowed real feeling to seep through. Not everyone played the game, of course. Some courtships were arranged quietly between families, sealed with coffee and coins before the couple ever truly met. But even then, the young people found ways to speak around the silence. A shared glance during tea, a small flower pressed between pages of a book. The rules bent in ways that didn't always break. And so, the world turned, slowly, fragrantly. Courtyards filled with breeze, market stalls pulsed with quiet longing, and in it all, fans whispered, fruit answered, and lovers learned a new kind of fluency. You let that thought settle, like the hush that follows a breeze through cypress trees. The Ottoman world, layered in rituals and soft resistance, taught that love didn't need volume to be powerful. It only needed patience, and maybe a pomegranate. There is a moment, fleeting, almost imagined, when your eyes meet someone else's, and the world around you seems to quiet for just a breath. That stillness, that delicate pulse of awareness, was the heartbeat of romance in the Ottoman Empire. You feel it now, as if you're walking through a narrow street where shadows shift and feet shuffle on stone. And suddenly, just beyond the veil of someone's window, a pair of eyes lingers on yours a moment too long. You look away. So do they. But the glance has already said what words are not allowed to. In a society that held modesty as a pillar of both faith and culture, eye contact was not taken lightly. For young people, especially women, direct gazes were often discouraged. A lingering glance could be considered forward, inappropriate, even indecent. And yet, that very danger gave it meaning. The forbidden glance was both an act of rebellion and an offering of hope. Quiet, bold, trembling. And so, love had to live in those in-between spaces. It danced along the edges of what was allowed, hiding behind lashes and fabric and timing. A glance was rarely just a glance. It was a message, wrapped in hesitation. A language of eyebrows, of lowered lids, of pausing just a second longer than politeness allowed. Imagine sitting behind a mashrabia window, the wooden screen filtering sunlight like lace. Through its tiny gaps, you can see the street below, and him. He passes every day, sometimes with a book tucked under his arm, sometimes empty-handed, always careful not to look up too soon. But when he does, your eyes meet. You pretend to adjust your scarf. You shift slightly behind the screen. But you saw him, and he knows. There's something tender in that. The mutual recognition of limits and the choice to connect anyway. To glance was not merely to look, it was to risk. A small personal revolution carried out in silence. This unspoken ritual stretched across all corners of life. In marketplaces, a woman might glance over a row of textiles and find herself locking eyes with someone across the stalls. At the mosque courtyard, in the brief moments between arrival and prayer, a look might pass like a ripple across water, noticed, then gone. And in the privacy of women's quarters, tales of such glances were told with sighs and laughter, passed along like fairy tales, both thrilling and impossible. But not every glance was innocent. There were rules, both social and spiritual, about how men and women interacted, especially outside of family or formal betrothal. Religious leaders often emphasized the value of modest gaze, encouraging people to guard their eyes and intentions. To linger too long, to invite too much with a glance, could lead to scandal. And yet, the more forbidden something becomes, the more deeply it can be desired. And so, the Ottoman youth walked a narrow path, their eyes cast downward in public, but hearts tilted skyward in secret. The art was in the subtlety. A proper girl wouldn't stare. She wouldn't even truly look. But she might position herself near the window when she knew he'd pass. She might sweep the floor at just the right hour, or step onto the balcony with a tray of tea that didn't need delivering. It wasn't about being bold. It was about being just visible enough. And the young men, well, they watched for these patterns like stargazers reading constellations. A girl who swept the same step 3 times in a row. A shadow that always moved at the same hour. That meant something, or maybe it didn't. That was the mystery. That was the thrill. Because ambiguity was part of the magic. Nothing was guaranteed. A glance could mean interest, or curiosity, or nothing at all. And sometimes, it was misunderstood. A girl might have simply been looking for her brother, and a boy might walk away convinced of fate. But even that confusion had its own charm. The poetry of almost families, too, became skilled interpreters, mothers, aunts, older sisters. They saw the patterns, they noticed the looks, they remembered how they once did the same, and they chose, quietly, when to intervene. Sometimes they discouraged, sometimes they encouraged, and with a nod, a story, a strategically placed cup of tea. But the young ones had their own ways, and the glance remained their language, silent, expressive, intimate. In some cases, courtship began and ended without a word ever being spoken. Glances grew into gestures. Gestures became messages. Messages turned into proposals whispered through intermediaries. And suddenly, what had once been a single shared moment across a street turned into a marriage arranged, or, sometimes, avoided, with grace. You think of them now, those boys and girls long gone, who once looked across alleys and courtyards the way you might look across a crowded cafe today. The emotion is the same, only the tools have changed, because the human heart still longs to be seen, still quickens under recognition, still dares, against all rules, to look. And so, you drift gently through that memory, real or imagined, of a glance that stayed with you, that dared to linger, that said, I see you, and I hope you see me too. The wind picks up slightly outside your window, somewhere far away, perhaps in an old part of Istanbul. A shutter creaks open, then softly closes again. The sound comes first, soft splashes echoing against smooth stone, laughter curling upward like rising steam. You step gently through the warm mist of the hammam, the Ottoman public bathhouse, where tiled walls glisten and the air smells of soap, lavender, and lemon. It's a place of ritual, of cleansing, of stillness and social current. And for many women, it is also a place where secrets float, as invisible and weightless as steam itself. Though men and women bathe separately, the bathhouse was far from solitary. It was community. It was conversation. It was the one place where women of different ages, backgrounds, and even classes could gather and speak without interruption, without eyes watching too closely. Here, beneath the domed ceiling and filtered light, news traveled faster than water over marble, and tucked within that news were messages, subtle ones, personal ones, sometimes romantic ones. You sink into the warmth and imagine the rhythm of voices around you, layered, melodic, woven with pauses and meanings. Among the ordinary talk of herbs, illnesses, bread, and fabric, there are glimmers of something else. A girl says she saw a quince on her doorstep. Another mentions the boy who walked past 3 days in a row. And then the older woman smiles, that knowing, amused smile, and says nothing at all, which is often the most meaningful answer of all. In the hammam, women didn't just wash their skin. They exchanged knowledge, impressions, and sometimes schemes. Matchmaking was one such craft, done with both gentleness and precision. A mother might casually mention her daughter's embroidery skills, letting it float just loud enough for the right ears. A friend might accidentally leave behind a kerchief from a suitor, embroidered with initials not quite hidden. The message passed on was never just what was said aloud. It was what followed it, the tone, the look, the silence that came after. There were even women known for their skill in this kind of delicate communication. Informal go-betweens, trusted aunts, loyal friends, women who carried observations from one house to another as if delivering spice or tea. They could be counted on to notice who had been looking at whom, who seemed to pause in the market, who walked a little slower past the same door. And their words, when they finally spoke, carried the weight of truth, or at least the poetry of it. But not all messages were so straightforward. Sometimes, a gift sent through the hammam said what a young woman could not. A small jar of rose jam left with another bather. A sachet of lavender passed along with a nod. These items weren't merely tokens. They were declarations veiled in politeness. And if the gift was accepted, or returned with a twist of ribbon or sprig of mint, the meaning changed entirely. And then there was the water itself, so constant, so present. To bathe beside someone was not just physical closeness, it was symbolic. To speak while steam blurred the edges of the room meant both parties agreed to pretend, just a little, that the world outside didn't exist. Secrets could be shared in a whisper, then erased by the next pour of water. No trace remained, no note to be intercepted, no gaze to be explained. You watch now as one girl whispers into the ear of her friend, hands moving under the surface of the water, tracing invisible letters on skin. They laugh, but not too loud. One of them lowers her eyes, bashful and delighted. She has just heard that he noticed, that someone told his cousin, who told her aunt, who told a neighbor, that he asked what time she walks to the fountain, that he looked for the scarf she wears on Thursdays. This is how romance works here, indirectly, gently, like a song half heard but remembered. Even the structure of the hammam itself seems to encourage this slowness, the marble slabs for lying still, the rhythm of heated rooms growing gradually warmer, the final rinse like a return to clarity. Love, like the bath, is a process of preparation, of layers removed and warmth built up slowly over time. And it is not always joyful. There are moments here, too, of sorrow, a broken promise carried in silence, a name no longer mentioned. These two are whispered in the hammam, soothed by water, softened by shared understanding. The women here do not judge easily. They have seen too much. They know that love, even the gentlest kind, can bruise like a fallen peach. Still, they encourage it, because they remember, because they once left roses on doorsteps or looked too long across the courtyard, because they, too, waited for signs that may or may not have come. You listen as the water echoes again and the steam thickens. A girl stands, wraps a towel around herself, and pauses near the door. Her cheeks are flushed, her eyes distant. She has heard something today, something that made her heart tilt just slightly toward hope. And as you follow her out, stepping slowly back into the cooler air of the world beyond, you realize that the hammam isn't just a place for bathing. It is a place for messages, for memory, for meaning passed hand to hand, as softly and carefully as a bowl of water poured across the shoulders. The doors close behind you with a hushed creak, and the light returns. The street is still there, with its winding rhythm and its waiting windows. But now, you know what lingers beneath. The quiet network of voices and signals, woven like steam into the spaces between. And somewhere, perhaps, he is walking by again, not knowing exactly what was said, but sensing that something has changed. The breeze carries the scent of cardamom and roast. You follow it, weaving past low doorways and tiled courtyards until you arrive in a sitting room dressed in cushions and quiet anticipation. A small copper pot simmers on a charcoal stove, dark coffee bubbling just beneath the surface. You're not here for refreshment, not exactly. This isn't just a visit, it's a beginning, or, at the very least, a question wrapped in tradition. Across the room sits an older woman, eyes lined with wisdom, hands folded neatly in her lap. She is not a relative, she is not a stranger. She is a Kavesi Kaden, a woman of coffee, a bringer of news, a guardian of potential futures. In the Ottoman Empire, this kind of woman was more than a matchmaker. She was a quiet orchestrator of lives. She doesn't ask questions directly. Instead, she watches. She notes how the girl serves the coffee, whether she spills a little in nervousness, whether she adds sugar without being asked, whether the cup is placed with trembling hands or steady grace. Each gesture, each detail, becomes part of the unseen report she carries back with her. Matchmaking, in this time and place, is both delicate and deliberate. It begins with suggestions, rarely spoken plainly. A woman might tell her neighbor, over laundry or lentils, that her niece is of marrying age, and, oh, how clever she is with embroidery. Another might comment on a boy's height or kindness while selecting olives at the market. The Kavochi Kaden listens. She connects. Once two families express even the gentlest interest, the dance begins. Coffee is brewed, seats are fluffed, and coins, discreet and symbolic, may pass from palm to palm. Not bribes, not payment, rather, small tokens to show respect, to acknowledge time, to bless the opening of possibility. And always, the girl listens in silence. She knows the rules. She knows not to speak first. Her job is to smile politely, to serve the coffee without meeting anyone's gaze too long. But her thoughts are racing. Has he seen her before? Has he walked past her gate? Did she once drop a rose where he might find it? The Kavesi Kaden may ask a few simple questions about family, about skills, about whether she enjoys baking or sewing or music. These are polite inquiries, but their answers are not trivial. They paint a picture, they hint, and the girl answers carefully, aware that every word may be repeated, remembered, carried forward like a scented envelope. In the next room, the men may be speaking as well, fathers and uncles, talking about business or weather or how many sheep so-and-so owns. But in this room, there is power, too. Quiet power. The women are shaping the future, not with demands, but with suggestions that ripple outward like warm water poured from a kettle. And coffee is always at the center, not only as a drink, but as a language. In Ottoman custom, a girl could communicate much through the coffee she served a potential suitor. If it was sweet, it meant approval. If it was overly bitter, the message was clear: try elsewhere. In some regions, a cup with salt instead of sugar was a challenge, a test of patience and sincerity. If the suitor smiled and drank it without complaint, perhaps he was worth considering after all. You imagine her now, stirring slowly, her fingers steady even as her heart flutters. She knows the weight of the moment. She feels her mother's glance, her aunt's breath held behind a veil. The Kaveh-Chikadin is watching, not just her hands, but her posture, her eyes, the way she holds herself in stillness. Because courtship in this world is not just about romance. It is about poise. It is about how well one moves within the quiet rules of society, how gracefully one performs the expected, while quietly revealing the unique. The Kaveh-Chikadin sees this. She reads between movements. She gathers impressions the way some women gather flowers, gently, selectively, aware of each stem's potential bloom. Later, she will walk back through the narrow streets. She may stop by another home, another courtyard, another kitchen with boiling pots. She will speak softly, perhaps only a few words. The girl has kind eyes, she might say, or she did not rush the pour, and that might be enough, but she does not rush decisions. She allows time, like dough left to rise. Perhaps another visit, perhaps a meeting at the mosque, or another pass by the house at sunset. Courting, in this time, is rarely hurried. It unfolds in circles, growing wider, more confident, until finally, someone steps forward. Sometimes, a match is never made. A girl might quietly refuse, perhaps by not refilling the coffee cup, perhaps with a shy smile that doesn't quite reach her eyes. And that refusal will be respected, carefully, gently, folded back into the silence. But when it works, when the signs align, when the glances turn to gestures and the coffee is just right, a new beginning quietly begins. A proposal may follow, or another cup. For now, though, the Kaveh-Chikadin nods. She sees enough for today. She rises, offers a small blessing, and steps into the golden light of the late afternoon. You remain behind, the scent of coffee still warm in the air, the sense that something important just happened, even if no one will speak of it directly. Because in the Ottoman world, matchmaking was never a moment, it was a process, a slow, fragrant unfolding. And sometimes, the quietest conversations changed everything. Evening settles softly, like silk unfurling across the sky. You walk beneath the dim glow of hanging lanterns, their light flickering in rhythm with the low hum of voices from nearby homes. Somewhere inside, two families sit facing one another across a patterned carpet. There is no music playing, and yet, what's happening here is very much a kind of dance, a negotiation, quiet and careful, performed with tea and nods and well-chosen words. It is the moment when the idea of marriage turns from dream to plan, and at the heart of it all is the dowry. In the Ottoman world, dowries were not simply material, they were symbolic, layered, and strategic. A family's honor, hopes, and whispered aspirations were all folded into chests of embroidered linens, silver spoons, and maybe a few carefully saved gold coins. But behind each item, behind each gift, there was meaning, sometimes obvious, sometimes not. You imagine the girl now, seated just beyond the doorway, pretending not to listen, but catching every phrase. Her mother had spent months preparing the chest, not just gathering items, but curating a portrait of her daughter's value, and, just as importantly, her family's taste. The dowry was not a price, but a message. She is capable, thoughtful, raised with care. She is ready. A good dowry reflected not only wealth, but wisdom. A humble family might offer hand-sewn towels so fine they seemed made of air. A wealthier one might include a silver teapot or a mirror from the bazaar in Damascus. But the emphasis was never on glitter. It was on substance. Every object suggested something about the woman behind it, her discipline, her creativity, her potential role in the home she might soon join. And it wasn't one-sided. The groom's family, too, offered gifts, jewelry, mostly gold coins strung on ribbons, a delicate ring, sometimes a promise of land or shared property. These gifts weren't showy declarations. They were gestures of balance. A courtship wasn't a transaction. It was a shared gesture of goodwill, a ceremonial handshake through silk and spice. Still, the process had its choreography. Meetings were formal, but softened by familiarity. Aunts and cousins spoke in gentle metaphors. "Our rose is blooming," someone might say, or "their house smells of good bread." These phrases meant more than they seemed. A blooming rose suggested youth, readiness, the smell of bread, stability, warmth, hospitality. And then there were the questions. Not direct, never rude. Instead of asking, "How much is the dowry?" one might wonder aloud, "How many towels a girl can embroider in a week?" Instead of asking, "Will she be obedient?" someone might mention how kindly she cares for her younger siblings. Everything was said sideways, but nothing was missed. You picture the family opening the dowry chest now, slowly, reverently, each item lifted with care. A copper bowl polished to a shine, a pair of slippers stitched with pomegranate thread, a small notebook filled with poems, perhaps not her own, but ones she loved. Each piece said, "This is who I am," in fabric and form, and somewhere within the chest, perhaps tucked beneath layers of lace, is a small envelope, a note written in the girl's handwriting. Not a confession, but a reflection, a line from a poem, a proverb about patience, a quiet sign that she, too, has a voice in what's to come. Because courtship, even within tradition, left room for individuality, for expression, and the dowry, for all its structure, was a canvas on which a young woman could paint herself into her future. There were missteps, of course. A dowry that seemed too grand could raise eyebrows. "They're trying too hard," someone might whisper, "too modest." And people might wonder if the family was unprepared. The balance was delicate. It required intuition, grace, the ability to read not only the items presented, but the silences that followed their unveiling. Mothers knew this game well. They had once played it themselves. They guided their daughters with soft warnings, warm encouragements, and the occasional firm redirection. Not too much lace, one might say. They should see your work, not your fortune. In some regions, the dowry was paraded, carried through the streets in wooden boxes with brass edges, announced to neighbors and celebrated as a rite of passage. In others, it was kept quietly behind doors, revealed only to the people who needed to see it. Each town, each household, each heart had its way. And still, beneath the gold and linen, beneath the surface of negotiation, was something tender, something unspoken. Hope. Hope that the items chosen would be received with kindness, that the gesture would be met with understanding, that the girl, whose hands had folded, stitched, selected, would find herself valued, not just for her belongings, but for her effort, her preparation, her her readiness to be loved and to love in return. Tonight, perhaps. She listens from her room, breath held just behind a curtain. She hears the laughter. She hears the pause. And then she hears her name spoken softly, not in negotiation, but in recognition. And maybe, just maybe, that is enough. Outside, the lanterns sway. Somewhere nearby, another family is beginning their own quiet conversation. Another chest is being packed. Another girl is threading a needle through silk, imagining what her life will look like in the home of someone she has not yet spoken to. But love, here, is never silent. It just speaks in different ways. In cups of coffee, in stitched towels, in whispered agreements sealed with coin and custom. The dance continues, slow, fragrant, and full of possibility. Somewhere between the last sip of sweetened coffee and the soft closing of a dowry chest, you hear another kind of offering, quieter than coins, lighter than linens, but perhaps heavier in meaning. It's a poem, or the trace of one, a line, just a line, repeated in the mind like a heartbeat, and with it, a pomegranate, round, red, bursting with promise. In the Ottoman Empire, poetry was not just an art form, it was currency, it was intimacy, it was a tool that lovers, would-be lovers, and those too shy to be either used to draw close to one another without stepping across the strict boundaries of custom. When love could not be said aloud, it was written. When it could not be written, it was remembered, tucked behind the teeth like a secret, shared only when the air was right and the words could fall softly enough not to break anything. You picture a young man now, seated cross-legged in the shade of a fig tree, a scrap of paper in his hand, worn at the edges. On it, a few lines of verse, copied, not his own, but chosen with care. Maybe a classic line from Fuzuli, the great poet of longing, maybe something newer, whispered from friend to friend until it found its way to him. His eyes trace the words slowly, lips moving silently. He is not thinking only of rhyme, he is thinking of her. She, perhaps, is at home sewing, humming, unaware, or maybe very aware, that someone has left a folded slip of parchment tucked into the fold of her shawl during yesterday's visit. She found it while brushing it out in the garden. She didn't read it right away. She waited until dusk, when the shadows felt safe and the house had gone quiet. She read it once, then again, then hid it beneath her pillow, and said nothing. This was how it often began, not with declarations, but with verses, sometimes delivered through a sibling, sometimes wrapped around a ribbon or tucked into a book of prayers. The poems said what could not be said, and if they were answered in kind, with a verse of equal weight, or a symbolic gift, like a pomegranate. You hold one now, in your hands. It's cool and heavy, skin leathery and deep in color. In Ottoman courtship, the pomegranate was layered with meaning, fertility, abundance, desire held in restraint. Its many seeds suggested complexity, a heart full of many chambers. To offer one was bold, but to accept it, to return one, that was bolder still. And not all gifts were accepted. Sometimes, the fruit would arrive unripe, deliberately. That, too, was a message. Not yet, or it might be overripe, cracked at the seams, oozing sweet juice. That could mean you waited too long. Everything had weight. Nothing was accidental. Even fruit had its language. There were stories told in low voices about lovers who wrote entire poems about a single apricot, or a cluster of grapes on a market stall. Young people in small towns, where everyone knew everyone, became experts in these rituals of suggestion. A boy might spend hours composing 2 lines. A girl might spend days deciding whether to respond with ink or silence. Not all poems were romantic. Some spoke of longing in the abstract, never naming names. Others wrap themselves in metaphor, a flower in a storm, a bird with one wing, allowing plausible deniability. It's just poetry, one might say. I wrote it for no one in particular, but everyone knew better. Even the script mattered. A poem written in neat, upright lines suggested discipline, sincerity, a more dramatic hand, sweeping loops, flourishes, hinted at passion. In calligraphy, too, there were dialects of desire. For those with formal education, love poems from Persian or Arabic traditions added elegance. Quoting Hafez or Rumi added depth. For others, Turkish folk rhymes or lullabies carried just as much feeling, sometimes more. Because courtship wasn't only for the scholarly, it belonged to anyone who could feel the ache of waiting. And waiting was everything. Sometimes the answer came in days, sometimes in weeks, sometimes never at all. A return poem might arrive pressed between pages of a borrowed book, or whispered through a neighbor, or delivered with a fruit seller's smile. You had to know how to read it, and how not to. You see her again now, the girl in the garden. She reads the poem once more. She smooths the creases. Then she writes something. Not a reply exactly, but a continuation. A thought that begins where his ended. She doesn't sign her name. She doesn't have to. She places it in a basket of figs and sends it with her younger brother to the family across the street. He's told to say nothing, just to deliver the fruit with politeness. The boy receives it as if it's nothing. Just fruit, just kindness. But when he's alone, he finds the paper tucked gently under the largest fig. He smiles. Not broadly, just enough. This is how it moves, like breath, like breeze, courtship by poetry and pomegranate, risk wrapped in beauty. There are, of course, moments of heartbreak, too. A poem never answered, a fruit returned untouched, the silence after something brave. But these, too, are part of the song, because even in its sadness, Ottoman courtship remained graceful. No shouting, no confessions in the rain, just the quiet turning of a page, the soft closing of a gate, the pomegranate that stays on the doorstep until it wilts in the sun. You breathe in deeply now, as if the air still carries traces of old verses. The Ottoman Empire is gone, but the echoes of its courtship linger, in gestures, in offerings, in words too delicate for speech. And somewhere, even now, someone is reading a poem they don't yet understand, and wondering if they're meant to reply. A silk veil flutters ever so slightly in the morning breeze. You're not sure if it moved on its own, or if someone behind it brushed it aside, just a fraction, to look out. Perhaps it was accidental. Perhaps it was intentional. In the Ottoman world, you begin to understand that such distinctions are not always clear. And in matters of love, suggestion was often more powerful than certainty. Clothing in this time was never just about modesty or fashion. It was part of the language. A carefully chosen color, a newly hemmed edge, a particular arrangement of layers. These choices spoke when voices could not. And for young women navigating the tightrope of tradition and curiosity, the fabrics they wore became their brush strokes. You imagine a young woman standing at her mirror, the small, silver-framed kind that distorts ever so slightly at the edges. She's adjusting her veil, not to hide, but to shape how she'll be seen. Will she wear the deep plum today? The one that only shows up on Fridays when she walks with her cousin to the fountain? Or the lighter green, gentler, less formal, but familiar? Even the way the veil is pinned matters. Tightly secured, it says, "I am unavailable," loosely draped, with a hint of hair at the edge. That says something else entirely. Of course, she would never admit that. If asked, she would insist it was simply too warm that morning, or that she ran out of time while dressing. But those who know, the girls her age, the aunts watching from balconies, they see the message, And it's not just veils, fabrics speak too. A sash with embroidery from a different town might suggest a recent visit, and perhaps a new admirer. A scarf with an uncommon weave might signal a gift received, worn quietly in return. In this society where direct courtship was restrained, these textile whispers became essential tools. Then there were shoes. To a modern eye, they might seem modest, flat, leather, sometimes pointed at the toe. But within this simplicity, there was room for expression. A newer pair worn to the market might mean, "I expect to be noticed." A scuffed heel left unrepaired might whisper, "Someone has been too distracted lately to care." And jewelry, oh, how carefully chosen it was. Earrings worn just once a week. A bracelet only brought out when a certain neighbor might pass by. A single ring shifted from one hand to the other. Each piece carried a history, a purpose, a rhythm known only to its wearer, and, perhaps, one watchful pair of eyes. You picture the suitor now, walking a little slower past the courtyard. His gaze practiced and casual, his expression neutral. But inside, he notices everything. The scarf tied in a new way, the veil a little brighter than usual, the absence of a brooch once worn without fail. He's learning to read her story, one fabric at a time, and she's writing it for him. But this was not always a performance of invitation. Sometimes, clothing also served as protection, a way to create distance, to decline attention without confrontation. A veil drawn tightly, eyes lowered, hands tucked into sleeves. A sharp line in the silhouette said, "Not today." These signs were read just as clearly, and often more quickly, than any poem. You may think it all a bit too subtle, a bit exhausting, perhaps. But there is grace in subtlety. There is power in deciding what to show, and when, and to whom. In a world where words were limited, these garments allowed women to speak with both confidence and care. Mothers understood this language too. They might suggest a certain sash, just in case. They might adjust a daughter's hem and say, "Someone might be watching." But their eyes twinkle as they do, remembering the days when they, too, wore messages stitched in silk. Even the act of washing clothes could be a performance. Imagine her at the fountain, scrubbing a brightly colored scarf with careful pressure, letting it catch the light, or hanging a particular veil on the line, just a little longer than necessary, knowing it would be seen from the street. And if she added a sprig of lavender to the pocket of her coat, that wasn't just for fragrance. That was memory. That was a reminder, perhaps of a poem once received, or of a glance once shared, perhaps of a suitor she no longer waits for, but remembers kindly. It was never just about being noticed. It was about being understood. Of course, not everyone played this game. Some dressed plainly, intentionally, resisting the rituals. Others overplayed their hand. Too much perfume, too many accessories, a veil too sheer, and were met with gossip, with whispers. The line between intrigue and impropriety was fine, and everyone knew where it was drawn. But when done well, when balanced like a poem and paced like a walk at dusk, the art of dress became part of the courtship itself, a dialogue stitched into cotton and satin, spoken silently through sleeves and hems. You pass a window now, and a breeze lifts the curtain inside. Behind it, a girl adjusts the edge of her veil, just slightly. She sees you see her, and though neither of you says a word, something passes between you, light, delicate, real. In another time, you might have read her scarf like a sentence, counted her bracelets like verses, wondered if the pattern on her sleeve was chosen or coincidental. But in this world, you understand, nothing is ever truly accidental. The sun is lower now, casting long shadows across the courtyard. A soft clinking of dishes floats from a nearby kitchen, and somewhere, a bird chirps a familiar evening tune. You pause at the edge of a doorway, And for a moment, you feel it. The stillness that falls when something important is being observed, not interrupted, just quietly noted. Behind a woven curtain, her mother watches, not openly, not sternly, but with the quiet attention that comes from years of reading silences, of translating glances, of remembering how it all once felt inside her own chest. Ottoman mothers, for all their gentleness, were rarely passive. They were guardians of reputation, yes, but also curators of possibility. And when it came to courtship, their role was both subtle and immense. You imagine the scene. A girl steps onto the balcony, pretending to shake out a freshly laundered scarf. Below, a young man lingers a bit longer than necessary near the fountain. They don't speak. They don't wave. But there's a rhythm to the moment, too synchronized to be chance. Inside, behind the patterned drape, her mother sits with a basket of thread in her lap, but she isn't threading the needle. She's watching, not to scold, not to stop, just to be aware. Because in this world, silence isn't ignorance. It's guidance with a soft grip. Mothers were the unofficial interpreters of courtship, the bridge between desire and decorum. While fathers discuss finances and family lines, mothers took note of posture, tone, and timing. They remembered whose son borrowed books from which library, who helped an elder across the street, who always brought home a clean reputation, and who didn't. But they didn't always say what they knew. That wasn't the way. Instead, they nudged gently. A suggestion here, a redirection there. Wear the green veil today, they might say. Or, that boy always seems to pass when you water the basil. Curious, isn't it? They asked questions without pressing. They offered observations dressed as jokes. And when their daughters blushed or looked away, they didn't push harder. They just folded the moment and tucked it away, like a handkerchief in a drawer. You may think they were overly protective, and yes, sometimes they were. But more often, they were practical romantics. They knew love mattered. They also knew the world didn't always welcome it without cost. Their watchfulness wasn't about control. It was about care. They remembered how quickly a reputation could change, how fragile approval could be. And so they watched, from balconies, from kitchens, from market stalls. Not to interfere, but to prepare. There's something tender about it, isn't there? The way they let their daughters believe they were unnoticed, while quietly clearing the path beneath their feet. And they weren't just watching daughters. Mothers watched the boys too. The ones who stopped to help carry water jugs. The ones who greeted elders with respect. The ones who, when caught staring too long, had the grace to look away. These boys weren't judged for glancing, not if the glance was gentle, respectful. Mothers noticed how long they stayed, how often they came, whether their steps slowed or quickened when approaching the house. They read intentions in the rhythm of footsteps, and how often a young man found a reason to pass by, even when there was no errand to run. Sometimes, they tested the waters. They might ask a friend in the neighborhood about a certain family. Not directly, never directly, but a simple, "Have you tried their fig jam?" could carry a world of meaning. If the response was warm, the inquiry continued. If it was cool, they moved on, quietly, without a trace. And sometimes, they interfered, just a little. If a match seemed unwise or too rushed, a mother might plan a visit that overlapped precisely with a would-be suitor's walk-by. Or she might gently remind her daughter to stay inside during certain hours. No confrontation, just subtle choreography. But just as often, they made space. If a daughter had been too quiet, too withdrawn, a mother might ask her to accompany her to the market, knowing full well who else might be there. Or she might invite the Kaveci Kaden for an afternoon coffee, opening the door for possibility without ever naming it. They understood the balance of timing. of waiting, of allowing romance to simmer just beneath the surface until it was ready, and not a moment before. You see her now, the mother behind the curtain. She's smiling, but only to herself. She sees what her daughter sees. She senses the hope, the tension, the nervous calculation, and maybe she remembers a pomegranate left on her own doorstep once, long ago. Maybe she wonders what happened to that boy. Later, when her daughter comes back inside, they won't speak of it directly. They'll talk about the weather, or the price of lentils, or which cousin is visiting next week. But the mother will fold her embroidery a little slower, glance once more out the window, and say, "You look nice in that scarf today. You should wear it again." And the girl will nod, hiding a small smile in her teacup. This is how it went, not with declarations, but with permission wrapped in observation. Ottoman mothers were the quiet architects of romance, building bridges one glance at a time. And perhaps that is the softest kind of love, one that watches, waits, and never rushes what needs time to bloom. A shutter creaks open just slightly, and soft light spills onto the floor of a quiet room. From inside, behind a curtain or a finely carved wooden screen, someone waits. She listens to the sounds of the street below, distant footsteps, the rustle of cloth, the faint clang of a copper pan in a nearby kitchen. Her heart isn't racing, not exactly, but it is aware, fully, delicately aware. Because in the Ottoman world, a window was never just a window. It was a stage, not for drama, not for spectacle, but for suggestion, for ritual, for the subtle theater of courtship that unfolded one glance, one gesture, one moment at a time, to a stranger. The window might seem like a barrier, a way to keep young women hidden from the world. But for those who knew, those who watched and waited, it was also a space of presence, a space where a girl could be seen without ever stepping into the street. You picture her now. She's not quite standing in the window. That would be too obvious. But she's near enough, adjusting the plants on the sill, dusting a book, straightening the curtain. These tasks take longer than usual today. And if someone happens to look up from the alley below, well, she doesn't look down right away. But she knows. He's there again. He always comes at the same time, just after the afternoon call to prayer, when the street is quieter and the shadows are soft. He's not walking fast. In fact, he seems to find something terribly interesting in the cobblestones, or in the awning of the bakery. But eventually, inevitably, his gaze lifts. Just a moment, and maybe, just maybe, she's already looking. Nothing is said, no wave, no smile, but something passes between them, delicate, familiar, repeated, a rhythm that both know, even if it has no name. In many Ottoman neighborhoods, windows looked inward, into shared courtyards or narrow alleys that seemed to belong to no one and everyone at once. These spaces became stages not just for women to appear, but for young men to perform their own kind of waiting, leaning casually against a wall, stopping to chat with a shopkeeper, tying and retying the same sandal strap. The window was the audience, the courtyard, the set. The whole world narrowed into this shared, suspended silence. It wasn't all by chance. Sometimes, a girl's mother would leave the curtain drawn back just an inch farther. Sometimes, an aunt would decide to water the plants later than usual, giving her niece a little more time at the sill. And sometimes, a neighbor might cough, loudly and conveniently, if someone stood watching too long. Everyone played their part. The props changed with the seasons. In spring, she might rearrange flower pots. In summer, she might peel fruit where the breeze could catch its scent. In winter, she might simply sit by the window with her sewing, the motion of her hands visible, steady, human. Each action, though ordinary, was a signal, and occasionally Just occasionally, she would drop something. A handkerchief, a flower, a fig, not carelessly, not accidentally, just close enough to be noticed, just far enough to be retrieved by someone attentive. If the boy picked it up and held it a second too long before handing it to her younger brother, or placing it carefully on the steps, then she'd know. The conversation had begun. Some boys responded in kind. A single rose left on the wall beneath the window, a tiny poem tied with twine, a folded piece of silk. These weren't bold gestures. They were invitations, the kind that could be explained away if questioned. It must have been left by mistake, someone might say, but everyone knew better. The power of the window was in its ambiguity. She could be seen, but not approached. He could appear, but not call out. It allowed for observation without intrusion, for expression without confession. And in that space, something rare was allowed to grow, longing without pressure, attention without demand. It required patience, so much patience. Sometimes, weeks would pass without change, the same routine, the same glances, and then, suddenly, she wouldn't appear. The window stayed closed, the curtains still, and the boy, walking past as always, would feel the difference like a chill in the summer air. Was she unwell? Had someone noticed? Had she lost interest? That silence held its own meaning, and it reminded everyone that nothing in this dance was guaranteed. A window could open, or stay shut. The story could move forward, or not. Even the architecture respected this uncertainty. The screens, often delicately carved from wood or shaped from lattice, created partial views. You might see an outline, a movement, but never the whole figure. This partial visibility gave protection. It also gave mystery. And in a world where modesty was required, mystery became a kind of freedom. She could choose how much to show, when to step forward, when to pull away. That choice, however small, mattered. You think of the girls who once leaned toward the light, knowing someone might be looking. The boys who waited on corners, pretending they weren't. The mothers who allowed it all, carefully, quietly, watching from their own shadows. And perhaps, tonight, another girl stands by her window. Perhaps she waters her plants a little slower. Perhaps she's hoping that someone is still walking past, not to speak, not to act, just to see and be seen, because sometimes that is enough. The window remains open, the curtain stirs, and the story continues, not with words, but with glances cast like petals on the wind. You follow the soft stir of a curtain as it settles back into stillness. The street is quiet now. A cat winds its way around a pot of basil, and the shadows of window lattice work stretch long across the stone. The boy is gone. His footsteps faded down the alley, but something lingers in the air, faint, fleeting. It's not smoke, not food. It's sweeter, something floral with the edge of something deeper. Musk, maybe, or amber. It's the scent of rosewater, clinging faintly to the edge of a cloth. And just like that, the next act begins, not with a letter, not with a glance, but with fragrance. In Ottoman courtship, when even the smallest gesture had meaning, the handkerchief became a powerful, portable language. It was modest, practical, but in the right hands, it was also deliberate. Woven from cotton or fine linen, sometimes trimmed with lace. It could be soaked in scent, embroidered with hints, or folded in precise ways that said what voices were not allowed to say. You picture it now, a small square of white, placed just so on the edge of a fountain or atop a low garden wall, maybe left behind, maybe not, maybe waiting for someone specific to find it. The boy who walks by the same corner every evening. The one who glanced up once and saw her through the screen. The one who has yet to speak, but has already said so much. He sees it, it looks ordinary, but he notices the faint pink edge, the tiny stitch of a tulip in one corner. That's not random. That's not a coincidence. Tulips, after all, carry meaning, passion, elegance, silent affection. And then he lifts it to his face. The scent is subtle but unmistakable, rose and sandalwood. It isn't just fragrance, it's presence. She has spoken. In this world, scents were more than decoration. They were memories, markers of identity, emotional bookmarks pressed between the pages of daily life. A woman might wear a signature scent, something carefully prepared with oils and herbs, mixed by her mother or a trusted apothecary. To carry that scent into the world, even on cloth, was to send a version of herself forward, and to receive it was not a casual thing. If he picked up the handkerchief and returned it too quickly, it might mean he wasn't ready. If he held on to it too long, that meant something else entirely. And if he returned it at all, folded neatly and perhaps carrying a different scent in return, then the conversation had truly begun. You imagine her now, seated on a cushion, watching the sky turn the color of ripe plums. She wonders whether he found it, whether he understood, whether the lavender was too faint or the cinnamon too bold. She doesn't ask her mother. She doesn't say a word, but she listens. Listens for footsteps the next evening, watches for the way he pauses at the wall, as if remembering something. The beauty of scent is that it cannot be seen. It cannot be proven. It is carried by air and memory, and that is what makes it perfect for this kind of communication. Intimate, invisible, undeniable once noticed. And it wasn't just the cloth. Letters, too, were sometimes perfumed. A folded slip of paper pressed into a book, exchanged through a sibling or a trusted friend. The poem inside mattered, yes, but so did the way it smelled. Musk for depth, citrus for youth, orange blossom for sincerity. A boy might read a verse and inhale deeply, letting the fragrance shape how he understood the words. It wasn't just reading, it was sensing. In this way, even absence became something to savor. If she didn't appear at the window, but the scent of her favorite soap lingered near the courtyard gate, that was something. If her scarf no longer carried jasmine, but something sharper, clove, perhaps, then maybe her feelings had shifted. Or maybe she was simply ill. The ambiguity was part of the tension, part of the allure. And not all handkerchiefs carried hope. Sometimes they carried endings. A cloth returned unscented, washed clean, folded too precisely. That, too, was an answer. A soft goodbye, a refusal dressed in courtesy, no sharp words, no confrontation. Just the echo of what had been, gently wrapped and returned to sender. But even those partings had dignity. In a society that valued restraint, expressing emotion through scent allowed lovers to be bold without being improper. It gave them space to feel deeply without needing to explain. A woman could soak a cloth in orange water and tuck it beneath a stone. If he found it and kept it, then she knew, and if not, well, no one needed to know. Mothers noticed, of course. They always did. A missing handkerchief, a daughter lingering a little longer over her lavender stash, a question about how long scent clings to cloth. They didn't ask much, but they adjusted the balance. A longer walk to the fountain, a second visit to the neighbors. Permission, as always, wrapped in silence. You step past a doorway now, and the air shifts. Someone has just left. A trace of frankincense lingers, sweet and earthy. It catches you unexpectedly, like memory. You wonder who wore it, who waited for it, who knew what it meant. Because in this world, a handkerchief is never just a handkerchief. It is a love letter without ink, a gesture without movement, a name whispered through scent and thread. You let the thought settle as the evening thickens. Somewhere, a cloth is being folded. Somewhere, Someone is breathing in and deciding what to do next. And maybe, just maybe, someone else is already waiting for that answer to arrive on the wind. The morning sun rises slow and golden, brushing gently across stone walls and rooftops still damp with dew. A small group of women walks along the edge of a garden path, their steps soft, their pace deliberate. Scarves flutter, sandals tap lightly against earth, and a gentle hush hums between them, the hush of something practiced, but never dull. You might think they are simply walking, but this is no casual stroll. In the Ottoman world, the public walk was rarely just about fresh air. It was a carefully observed ritual, an opportunity for young women to be seen, but never appear as though they wanted to be. And for young men, it was the one moment, brief, orchestrated, and chaperoned, where they might witness a girl moving through the world just enough to wonder what her world was like. You see them now? Two sisters, a cousin, and their mother. The older women lead the way, voices low, their conversation floating softly into the breeze. The younger girls trail just behind, heads bowed modestly but eyes scanning in the subtlest of ways. The path they follow isn't random. It winds near the neighborhood fountain, past the vendor who sells honeyed nuts, past the window with the carved frame, the one that always seems freshly polished, the one someone might be watching from. For the girls, this walk is both freedom and constraint. They are outside, yes, moving, visible, but they are also performing, aware of every movement, every step, every glance that might catch the corner of a curious eye. Their veils are secure, their expressions composed, but within that structure, there is softness, subtlety, a twist of the wrist, a turn of the head, a scarf adjusted more slowly than necessary, and across the street, or from a nearby bench, or leaning against the shade of a fig tree, the boys watch, not with leering stares or loud whispers, but with practiced patience. The good ones do, at least. They know this isn't the time to speak or approach. This is not about claiming attention. It's about witnessing grace. A girl might not even look up, or she might glance once, quickly, not at anyone in particular, just enough to be noticed by whoever is hoping to be. That one glance could say everything, or it might say nothing at all. The beauty was in the ambiguity. These walks happened in the early morning or just before dusk, never in the heat of the day, never when the streets were too crowded. Sometimes they happened after prayers, when the streets were quiet but expectant, filled with the rustling of skirts and the soft murmur of neighbors pretending not to notice each other's children. And always, there was a chaperone, mothers, aunts, older sisters. The presence of an elder woman ensured propriety, but it also created space for subtle rebellion. The girls weren't alone, but they weren't invisible either. The elders watched, yes, but they watched with understanding. They remembered their own walks, their own glances, their own moments of maybe. You picture a boy now, holding a basket of bread he doesn't need to buy, standing a little too long near the walnut cellar. His friend teases him quietly, nudges him in the ribs, but he barely reacts. He's waiting. And then he sees her, the girl in the pale scarf, the one who once dropped a fig by his doorstep. Or maybe it just seemed that way. Her head is turned slightly, her lips moving as if reciting a prayer or a poem. And as she passes, she adjusts the strap of her sandal, bending ever so slightly. He sees the motion. He holds his breath. Did she mean to do that? Did she know he'd be there? He won't know. That's part of the ache. That's the joy. Because in this quiet game, certainty is rare. Everything hovers on the edge of maybe. Sometimes, a mother will pause the walk just long enough by a stall where a particular boy always lingers. Sometimes, a girl's scarf will match the color of a poem he once sent, and he will wonder if it's coincidence. These hints are never confirmed. But they are never forgotten. There were even phrases for these outings. Airing the linens, some would joke. Blessing the street with footsteps. Others said, these playful idioms disguised what everyone knew. This was the only time a girl could walk in the open and still be within the bounds of what was acceptable. And so, she walked beautifully, modestly, carefully, with every step speaking what her voice could not. Some walks ended in silence. No one appeared. No glance was returned. The scarf was not noticed, and the girls would return home to their embroidery, their tea, their dreaming. But other walks changed lives. A repeated glance, a poem passed through a friend, a mother's sudden interest in visiting a neighbor. The walk set the rhythm. The rest followed, and still, the streets remember. The stones have felt the same footsteps, day after day. The wind has carried the same hope, quiet and steady. Even now, in quieter neighborhoods, you might see the echo. A girl walking slightly behind her aunt. A boy pretending to shop for something he never buys. You might think nothing is happening, but everything is happening, because the Ottoman courtship walk was never about spectacle. It was about presence. It was about creating the smallest opening for possibility. An opening no one could criticize, but anyone could step into if they had the courage to notice. And perhaps, as you imagine this soft procession along cobblestones, worn smooth by time, you understand something else. That love, when held gently, doesn't need a stage, just a street, a breath, a pair of eyes that happen to meet at just the right moment. The street fades behind you, and so does the softness of everyday life, the shared glances, the handkerchief scented and folded just so, the shy walks under fig trees. Now you pass through stone archways and cool colonnades, into another world entirely. Here, silence is thicker, movement is measured, and everything, even love, is bound in gold thread and shadow. You've entered the palace, more specifically, you've entered the harem, a word often misunderstood, romanticized or distorted by distant imaginations. But in the Ottoman world, it simply meant the private quarters of the household, a space for women, a space of order, structure, expectation, and yes, at times, a space where something resembling love tried to grow. Inside, the rules of courtship shifted. They didn't disappear. They became more intricate. Within these high, painted walls, behind embroidered curtains and mosaic-tiled baths, lived women from many places, daughters of noble families, gifted girls from allied provinces, and those selected for their beauty, intelligence, or refinement. Some arrived with quiet ambition, others with fear, most arrived with no choice at all, but all learned the same lesson, that even here, where their movement was limited, their voices monitored, and their futures uncertain, the heart still found ways to speak. The palace was not a place for casual courtship. There were no handkerchiefs dropped discreetly from windows, no strolls by candlelight, and yet, feelings formed, affections took root, sometimes between a concubine and the prince, sometimes between a servant and a guard, sometimes between two people who were never supposed to notice one another. You imagine her, a girl perhaps 15 or 16, new to the harem, still unfamiliar with the weight of her own silence. She serves tea to the Valid Sultan, the mother of the reigning sultan, careful not to spill, careful not to look up too long. And yet, she senses the presence of someone behind her, not a prince, not a rival, just a musician, seated in the corner, tuning a long-necked lute. Their eyes meet, just once, and that, in a world this controlled, is enough to begin something. The women of the palace lived under constant observation, yet they developed languages of their own, ways of speaking through song, through gifts, through pauses and routine. a favorite scarf left in a hallway, a melody hummed at the same hour each day, a line of poetry recited during a lesson, chosen not for its beauty, but for who it might reach. And yet, this was not a love story in the usual sense. It could not be, because within the harem, affection was rarely private and rarely free. A favored concubine might be elevated in status, even bear the sultan's children. But that affection, once known, became currency. It became politics. It became threat, which is why true courtship, the tender, unspoken kind, often remained in the corners, in the silences between duties, in the glimpses no one was meant to see. You picture a folded piece of paper, tucked into the pages of a Quran, not by accident. You imagine a bottle of attar perfume, left uncorked on a tray, the scent chosen not for herself, but for someone who once complimented it in passing. You hear the soft strum of the ode from the music room, repeating a certain phrase over and over, not because the musician forgot, but because someone is listening. There were dangers, of course. Secrets discovered meant punishment, exile, demotion, shame. But what's remarkable is not that some were caught, but that so many kept their secrets for so long. That love, even here, could be folded small enough to hide in a sleeve. Sometimes, the affections that bloomed were never romantic. They were friendships, fierce, devoted, intimate in the ways only women bound together by circumstance can understand. A hand squeezed during prayers, a bite of fruit saved from a tray, a whispered joke in the dark. These bonds, too, were a kind of love, not the public sort, but the kind that endures in memory. And then there were the moments no one could explain. A concubine who began to hum every morning while combing her hair, a guard who lingered by the fountain longer than usual, a girl who wore the same necklace every Tuesday, though no one had seen it gifted to her. These were the moments people noticed, remembered, passed along in quiet whispers. Stories shaped not by fact, but by yearning. You might wonder if these quiet romances ever survived. Some did. Some girls became consorts. Some married well when their time in the palace ended. Some guards requested transfers and were granted them without question. Others carried their stories in silence, all the way into old age, sharing them only in fragments, years later, beneath the shade of a courtyard tree. Because love inside the palace didn't always need to be fulfilled. Sometimes, it was enough that it existed at all, that, despite the rules and the expectations, someone once looked across a room and saw something more than duty. You walk now through an imagined hallway, tiles cool beneath your feet, the scent of jasmine lingering behind embroidered curtains. You sense the memory in the walls, the softness of feelings folded carefully into the seams of garments and songs. Not loud, not bold, but there. And perhaps that is the most Ottoman thing of all. A love that knows how to survive in stillness. A love that waits. A love that writes itself in gestures so quiet. They can only be heard by the heart. You step beyond the palace walls now, where the courtyards grow wider, the streets hum gently with life, and the rhythm of daily routine resumes like a soft drumbeat. But even here, outside of formal ceremony and royal gates, love does not go unnoticed. It never truly does. In Ottoman towns and villages, whether nestled along the Bosphorus or tucked between olive groves, another kind of power shaped the path to romance, the community. Eyes were everywhere, not menacing, not malicious, not usually anyway, but observant, curious, engaged. In a society so closely woven, where neighbors shared water, bread, and the heat of the same afternoon sun, no moment went entirely unseen. The shopkeeper saw who lingered near whose stall. The baker noticed whose daughter came for bread a little earlier than usual. The laundry women shared more than soap and suds. They passed stories, impressions, small details that settled like dust and slowly shaped reputation. You pass a wooden doorway now, cracked just enough to see the light flickering inside. Someone's grandmother sits near the threshold, peeling garlic with practiced hands. She's not looking up, not exactly, but she sees, she always sees, and she remembers. Years ago, she saw her own daughter pause in front of the spice vendor's cart a little too long. Years before that, she watched as her best friend fell in love with the boy who played the flute near the tea house. These memories don't fade. They curl and soften but remain, ready to guide the next generation in their own unspoken dances. In Ottoman life, the community didn't just witness courtship, it shaped it, reinforced its boundaries, encouraged it quietly, occasionally discouraged it, even more quietly. Sometimes a match was obvious before the young couple even admitted it to themselves. The signs stacked up gently, a scarf worn twice in the same week, a young man choosing the long way home, a girl beginning to ask questions about his mother's cooking, casually, as if it didn't matter. And when the signs aligned, the community offered gentle support, a well-timed invitation to a family meal, a neighbor who happened to mention that the boy was looking for a wife, a midwife who quietly reminded a mother that her daughter's dowry chest was nearly ready. But the community could be cautious too, protective. If a boy's intention seemed too quick, too eager, an older cousin might make his presence known on the street corner. If a girl was seen crying near the fountain, the olive vendor might frown a little more deeply at the boy who had walked by earlier. No one said anything directly. That wasn't the way. But they made themselves felt. This gentle surveillance was not always oppressive. For many, it offered safety, a kind of shared guardianship. Girls were not left entirely alone to decipher the intentions behind every glance or gesture. Boys were not free to promise what they could not deliver. The village, the neighborhood, was the unspoken chaperone, the ever-present audience to a courtship quietly unfolding. Even the children played a role. They were the runners, the messengers, the accidental informants. A brother who noticed a scarf left at the gate, a niece who repeated an overheard rhyme, a little boy who asked, without guile, why the same visitor kept bringing dates every Thursday. Their innocence often carried the most truth. And then there were the women of the street, the fabric sellers, the soap makers, the seamstresses, women who moved easily between homes and could carry impressions as naturally as they carried bolts of cloth. They never gossiped, not openly, but they noticed, they advised, they occasionally nudged fate with a tactful word or a well-placed compliment. You hear them now, the soft rustle of their skirts, the click of their sandals on stone. One of them passes two young people on the street and smiles to herself. She will say nothing today, but she will remember, and perhaps tomorrow. She will stop by the girl's mother's house, asking for tea, and mention what a respectful boy he seemed, how he always carries fresh herbs, how he once helped her carry a basket. Just enough, just a little hint. In this way, love was rarely private, but it wasn't invasive either. It existed within the collective memory of the community, shared, sustained, and, when necessary, protected. Of course, mistakes happened. Not every affection bloomed. Not every young man proved worthy. Not every glance meant what it seemed to. And sometimes the community erred, drawing lines too tightly, letting pride or rumor sway judgment. But more often, they acted with care, with the kind of long-sighted wisdom that comes from watching many seasons pass. Many marriages made, many hearts quietly mended. You think now of a girl sitting near her mother at the loom, pretending not to notice the woman who has just arrived for mending. They speak of thread, of color, of stitch work, but beneath it all, a second conversation hums. The woman has seen something, She has heard something, and the mother listens with one ear while her daughter listens with both. And when the guest leaves, the girl says nothing. She simply hums a tune that has no words and continues her weaving, a little slower, a little softer. Because even in this tight weave of eyes and whispers, of neighbors and nods, something delicate persists. The belief that if two people are meant to find each other, they will, that amid the noise, love finds its path. Perhaps it's not as private as you once imagined. Perhaps that's the point. That love, like bread or laughter, was meant to be shared, not fully, not loudly, but gently, through the lives of others. And maybe, just maybe, every person who noticed along the way was part of the story, too. The air tonight is a little heavier, a little slower. You sense it in the way the shutters close earlier than usual, in the way the street lamp flickers twice before holding steady. Something lingers in the silence, not a secret, but something like sorrow, the kind that lives not in cries or shouts, but in the small, steady gestures of someone carrying disappointment with quiet dignity. Because in the Ottoman world, not every courtship ended in joy, not every poem was answered, not every scarf was noticed, and even the most carefully arranged matches, even the most watched, whispered, and waited for unions, could come undone before the ink dried on the agreement. These were the broken promises. A boy might stop passing by. A handkerchief might go unanswered. A dowry chest, carefully prepared over months, might remain closed. There would be no dramatic announcement, no public collapse. Just a pause in routine. A window that stayed shut. A girl who wore more muted colors. A mother who stopped glancing toward the gate. You picture her now, seated near the hearth, rolling wool between her palms without purpose. Her fingers are busy, but her thoughts drift. Her sisters speak of someone else's betrothal, and she nods politely. But the smile doesn't reach her eyes. She is remembering the poem she didn't return, or perhaps the one she did, only to never hear anything more. In a culture so attuned to subtlety, even disappointment was expressed in quiet forms. A girl might change her usual route to the fountain. She might braid her hair differently. She might begin to sing a new tune, one that sounds cheerful but, if you listen closely, carried a trace of longing. And yet, from these quiet sorrows, something unexpected sometimes grew, a kind of rebellion, not loud, not harsh, but a soft resistance. A decision to choose differently, to wait longer, to refuse the next suitor who arrived too soon, with too many assurances and not enough poetry. Ottoman girls were expected to be gentle, composed, accepting of the plans laid out before them. But occasionally, they pushed back, not by storming out, but by sewing slower, by forgetting to smile, by refusing to prepare coffee for a guest they knew was meant for matchmaking. You hear her voice now, carefully polite but firm. I think the salt is spoiled. I'll make the coffee again tomorrow. A refusal, veiled in sweetness. Sometimes a girl would insist on finishing her education first. A new embroidery style, a second language. Sometimes she would ask for a delay, claiming an unfinished dowry, though everything had been packed for weeks. And sometimes, with the help of a sympathetic aunt or a very brave mother, she would say no in a way no one could argue with. But everyone understood. Of course, rebellion had consequences. A rejected suitor could damage a reputation. A delayed marriage could invite whispers, but not always. And for some girls, the quiet risk was worth it. You think now of the girl who stitched her sorrow into the hem of a hand towel. Tiny words written in thread too pale for the eye to catch unless it looked very closely. Or the girl who sang a folk tune every morning about a bird that wouldn't land, until her father finally stopped asking questions. Or the girl who wore her ring on the wrong finger until the boy she truly liked noticed, and answered, simply by doing the same. Not every rebellion was sad. Some were playful. Some were rooted in deep hope. In one village, they say a girl baked a loaf of bread with a message hidden inside, a small piece of parchment wrapped in cloth. She gave it to the matchmaker to deliver to a potential suitor she had no interest in. The note read, "You deserve a better meal than this." He declined politely, and both families saved face. These soft rebellions were not acts of defiance in the modern sense. They were a way of preserving dignity, of steering the course of one's life within the gentle boundaries of what was possible. A way of saying, I know the rules, and I will follow most of them, but not this one, not today. And often, the community understood. A neighbor might speak up on her behalf. An older sister might offer a distraction. Even a grandmother might feign forgetfulness, claiming she hadn't realized the boy came calling. "He seemed nice," she'd say, "but I couldn't find the good teacups." And that would be the end of it. In these moments, women helped women, quietly, consistently, because they, too, had once hidden disappointment beneath a veil. They, too, had once waited for a glance that never came, or mourned a promise never made. And they knew, deeply, that the heart cannot be arranged like flowers in a vase, no matter how carefully placed. You listen now to the stillness of a house where someone is quietly mending more than cloth. You watch as a girl stands a little taller after a week of silence. She no longer waits by the window. She no longer lingers near the garden gate. But her eyes are clear again. Her scarf is a bit brighter. Her step more certain. Because hearts do heal, especially when given space. Especially when those around you speak gently, act kindly, and let the story shift direction without insisting on the ending. And sometimes, not often, but sometimes, the one who once walked away returns, with a softer step, a better poem, a sweeter fruit, and this time, the answer is different. You smile, just a little, as you imagine it, the cloth left again on the garden wall, the scent familiar, the stitch unchanged, and yet everything inside it is new. The soft resistance gives way, eventually, to a quiet agreement. There is no grand proposal, no dramatic unveiling. Instead, there's a table, a cup of sweetened coffee, a folded cloth set carefully between two families, and atop it, a document, neatly written, signed, witnessed, the nikah, the marriage contract. It may not look like romance. There are no hearts drawn in the margins, no lines of poetry in the margins, at least, not openly. But this paper, brief and formal though it appears, carries more feeling than it seems. In the Ottoman world, the nikah was a legal document. It outlined rights, obligations, dowries, terms. But beneath the ink, it often held hope. It was the final gesture of a courtship, made almost entirely of gestures. You lean over the parchment now. The calligraphy is precise. A scribe, likely chosen by the groom's family, has taken care with each line. The names are written in full, hers and his. Her father's name, his grandfather's. The amount of the mahr, the bride's dowry, promised by the groom, perhaps money, perhaps land, perhaps symbolic. A coin pressed into her palm, offered with reverence and ritual. At first glance, it's transactional, but then you read more closely. Some contracts contain small additions, requests made by the bride, spoken through her family, agreed to with a nod. She may visit her parents once per month. She will bring her maid with her. He shall not take another wife without consent. These lines may seem technical, but they speak. They say, I want to feel safe. I want to keep something of myself. I want this love to come with respect. And on his side, too, there is room for meaning, his acceptance, his signature, his delivery of the mahr. These are gestures not of control, but of consent, of saying, yes, I enter this with you. In this culture, where public affection was rare, where a love letter might never be written, this agreement was the closest many would come to declaring, I choose you. You think now of the girl from earlier, the one who once left a handkerchief near a fountain, who waited through long pauses and half answers, who once stitched sorrow into the hem of her scarf. She sits beside her mother now, calm, quiet, listening as the notary reads the terms aloud. She does not speak, not today, but she knows every line. And when the time comes, she gives a small nod. That's all it takes. Later, there will be a ceremony, simple or grand, depending on the families, but this, right now, is the true beginning. A promise made not in flowers or rings, but in ink. A love shaped not through fireworks, but through mutual willingness. Still, romance finds its way in. You hear it in the softness of the scribe's tone. In the careful way the groom places the gold coin in her hand, not dropped, but offered, palm to palm. You see it in the way he avoids her eyes, shyly, though they have met many times before. In the way her uncle smiles slightly when he hears that she requested her books be brought to her new home. Because this contract, however plain it may seem, is never just about law. It is about trust. It is about building a small bridge across the uncertainty of the future. And for two people raised in a world where glances held entire conversations, where scarves and spices did the talking, this piece of paper says, quietly and clearly, we understand each other, and we will try. Sometimes, the bride includes a verse at the end, not in the contract itself, but on a separate slip of paper, tucked into the folds of her veil, a line of poetry, a proverb, a phrase only the groom will understand. She doesn't hand it to him. It's passed through a cousin, a younger sibling, a trusted friend. He receives it later, perhaps that night, and when he opens it, the words mean more than any speech ever could. You smile at the thought, because what looks like formality to the outside world is, for them, something tender, something shared, and yes, not every contract is drawn in love. Some are arranged with haste, some are filled with pressure, compromise, resignation, but many, far more than you'd think, carry seeds of affection. And from that affection, something real begins. Even the contract's materials matter. A finer paper signals care. A red thread tying the pages together says, we want this to last. The ink, dark and permanent, is chosen for its steadiness. The groom's name is written first, but hers is written with equal elegance. That, too, is a message. And after it's done, after the papers are folded and the witnesses sign and the tea is poured, something shifts. The boy who once waited by the olive tree no longer lingers. The girl who once paused near the fountain no longer wonders. They have crossed into something new. There is relief, yes, but also something softer. The quiet joy of having been chosen and of choosing in return. For two people who once learned each other through fabric, through fragrance, through glances and patience and long afternoons filled with wondering, this contract is the answer. Not the end of love, but its beginning in a different form. And perhaps that's what makes it beautiful. Not the paper, not the coin, not even the signatures, but the silence that follows, full, warm, certain, the silence of two people who no longer have to speak in code. The ink has dried. The contract is folded and placed in a silk pouch embroidered with tulips and stars. The mar has been given. Hands have been shaken. Smiles exchanged. And yet, somehow, everything still feels suspended, like the air before a summer rain. Because the wedding is still to come, and with it, the moment when private love becomes public knowledge. But in the Ottoman world, even the wedding day was layered in ritual, symbolism, and just enough mystery to keep love from becoming too easily claimed. You hear the drums before you see the procession, a slow, rhythmic beat carried through the winding streets, wrapped in laughter and laced with the scent of rosewater and clove. The women begin their ululations, sharp, joyful bursts of sound rising like birds from the rooftops. And in the center of it all is the Jilin, the bride, hidden beneath layers of silk, her hands painted with henna, her head covered by a richly embroidered red veil. She does not speak. She does not walk alone. She is surrounded by cousins, sisters, women who sing and shield and guide her toward a threshold she has only ever imagined from a distance. And yet, despite the music, despite the celebration, there is a hush inside her that cannot be dressed in jewels, because for many Ottoman brides, this moment, this leaving, was as much an ending as it was a beginning. You picture her now, sitting quietly in her father's house the night before, knowing it may be her last night there. She touches her books, the wall where she once traced moonlight with her fingers, the cushion where she first dreamed of a name spoken softly. Everything is about to shift. She will no longer belong entirely to this house. And though she is not being given away like an object, though her consent has been honored and her wishes heard, this transition still carries weight, which is why, in many villages and towns, the bride vanishes. Not forever, not truly, but symbolically. It is an old tradition, sometimes playful, sometimes poignant. On the morning of the wedding, when the groom's family comes to escort the bride to her new home, she is not there, or rather, she is there somewhere, but not available, not immediately. She cannot be found, they say. And so, the procession waits. Sometimes the groom's side negotiates with sweets or coins or poems. Sometimes a brother blocks the door, arms folded in mock defiance, until he's offered a token. A neighbor might tease, "You must prove she is worth it." A grandmother might demand a verse, a promise, a prayer. It's theater, yes, but it's also a final act of autonomy, a declaration that the bride does not simply pass from one house to another. She chooses, she delays, she makes space for herself within the ritual. Eventually, she appears, not rushed, not embarrassed, but radiant and composed, flanked by the women who have walked this path before her. She is not led. She moves with intention. She is not silent because she has nothing to say. She is silent because everyone already knows. The walk to her new home is long, or feels long. Women toss flower petals along the path. Children dart between legs. Neighbors peer from windows, watching the layers of ceremony unfold. The bride's veil may flutter just enough to hint at a smile, or she may keep her face hidden, holding the mystery a moment longer. When they arrive, the groom waits. He, too, has changed. No longer the boy who once stood by the garden wall or sent poems through friends. Today, he wears embroidered robes, a sash tied with care, shoes cleaned twice that morning. He is nervous, not because he doubts her, but because this day is no longer a dream. She is coming, and when she crosses the threshold, the world changes. But even here, tradition has one final flourish. The bride stops just before the doorway. She may be offered a coin or a bowl of honey. She may be asked to step over a sword or scatter sugar at her feet. Each action has meaning, sweetness, strength, blessing, her family's hopes distilled into gestures passed down for generations. Inside, the celebrations continue. Food is shared. Music rises. The bride and groom sit side by side, hands brushing only lightly, if at all. Their first conversation may still wait until the house empties, until the candles dim, until the door closes behind the last of the guests. But everything has already been said, through veils and windows, through scents and silences, through refusal and consent, distance and approach. This wedding, for all its grandeur, is simply the confirmation of what began long before, the flicker of a glance, the passing of a handkerchief, the slow unfolding of trust. And though the community celebrates as one, it is these two who now face something entirely their own, a life to be shared, a rhythm to discover, a new kind of intimacy born not in rebellion, but in recognition. You leave the noise behind now, following the scent of saffron rice and candle wax into the quiet corners of the home. The bride sits near the hearth again, this time in a different house. She unties her sash. She touches the edges of the mirror placed for her near the door. She removes the red veil and breathes. And maybe, just maybe, she smiles, because the journey was long, but the ending was hers. And perhaps that's the gentlest truth of all in the Ottoman way of love, that amid the layers of tradition, the watchful eyes, the customs and contracts, a woman could still shape her story, not loudly, not defiantly, but with grace, intention, and quiet certainty. Now, the music has faded. The lanterns have gone out one by one, each puff of candle smoke rising like a tiny sigh into the early dawn. The laughter has softened into memory, and the footsteps that once filled the corridors have grown still. You're left here, in this quiet, with the final thread of the story trailing softly between your fingers. And that's fitting, because love, in the Ottoman world, was always stitched from threads of silk and scent, of caution and courage, of glances that lingered and steps that hesitated, threads that passed through families, across balconies, between doorways, and through closed windows. They tied people together gently, not in knots, but in ribbons, loops of possibility, of hope. And now that you've walked the full length of this story, from the scent of rosewater in the market stalls to the hush of the wedding night, perhaps you begin to feel what those threads carried. Not just romance, but restraint, elegance, mutual recognition. Because love here wasn't a loud declaration. It wasn't chasing someone down a train platform or shouting across a crowded ballroom. It was knowing when not to speak, when to look away, gently, when to return a borrowed scarf without a word, and trust that the message had been understood. And maybe, just maybe, that quiet kind of love lasts longer. You picture them now, the couple from the courtyard, the girl with the jasmine-scented sleeves, the boy with olive skin and hesitant eyes. Married now, months into their new life. She prepares tea without asking how he takes it. She already knows. He sets her book on the windowsill before leaving for the market, the page marked with a dried clove. They don't need to say, "I love you" every morning. It's in the silence between them, in the softness of their footsteps, in the gentle familiarity of choosing one another, still, each day. That kind of love grows slowly, but it endures. And for all the strictness we might imagine, the rules, the supervision, the elaborate codes, there was also great tenderness here, a kind of mutual shielding, a way of falling in love that didn't rush past the details but rested in them, like sunlight through lattice work. You breathe in now, imagining the scent of cardamom lingering in the folds of a wedding veil. You hear the soft clicking of beads being sewn onto a new bridal scarf. In a village somewhere, a grandmother passes down a story, not with lessons, but with laughter. A girl giggles, embarrassed. A boy smiles quietly to himself, pretending not to listen. And something begins again. Because even though centuries have passed, some of these customs remain. You might still find a note folded into a prayer book, still hear music in the street that signals more than celebration, that signals beginnings. In some homes, a red veil still waits at the bottom of a chest. In others, A girl still leaves a piece of fabric near a boy's gate, not for the wind, not for accident, but for him. And even if the world has changed, even if messages now fly faster than pigeons ever could, and emotions are shared in bursts of glowing screens, still, something in us longs for the quiet courtship, the slow recognition, the sacred privacy of knowing, deeply, quietly, that someone sees you and still chooses you. So, perhaps tonight, you feel that whisper, not from the past, exactly, but from something still alive beneath it. A belief in softness, a trust in patience, a reverence for the little things, the angle of a glance, the warmth of offered tea, the presence of someone who doesn't need to speak to be heard. And even if your love story looks very different, even if it begins with coffee in a crowded cafe or a shy smile across a train platform, perhaps there's still room for the Ottoman way. Not in rules, not in rituals, but in rhythm. The rhythm of listening before speaking, of noticing before acting, of loving slowly, steadily, without needing applause. And now, as the stars stretch across the sky and the last threads of the night curl around you like soft embroidery, you can let it all settle. The laughter, the customs, the faded silk, the hidden poems, the half-heard songs. They drift through your thoughts like scattered petals, fragrant, weightless, comforting. You've walked with these lovers. You've sat beside them in the garden, waited with them by the window, danced with them in their silences. And now, you carry something of their world with you, not a lesson, not a rule, but a mood, a hush, a warmth. Let that warmth linger. Let it settle in your breath, in your fingers, in the quiet behind your eyes. And if sleep is ready to greet you now, let it come gently, like a veil lowered, like a hand brushed across your shoulder, like the last note of a song that doesn't need to end loudly to be remembered. Thank you for joining me here in this soft unfolding of quiet love and hidden rules. Wherever you are, whether you're curled beneath a blanket or watching the slow flicker of candlelight across the wall, may your dreams carry something kind tonight, something timeless. And when you wake, may you remember just one thread, a moment, a line, a smile behind a scarf, a story, stitched with care and folded into the quietest corners of your heart.